It was a cold autumn morning when I finally decided to embark on the solo trip I had been planning for months. The idea of spending a week in an isolated place, away from everything and everyone, had always fascinated me, but I had never had the courage to do it alone. When my friend, who was initially going to join me, had to cancel due to a work emergency, I thought about giving up. However, something inside me, an uncontrollable desire to seek peace and solitude, pushed me to continue alone. I had all the gear ready: a heavy backpack with supplies, a tent, sleeping bag, and dehydrated food. The mix of anxiety and growing excitement made my heart beat faster as I drove towards the trailhead. When I entered the dirt road, the trees around me were starting to change color, tinted in golden and red hues by the arrival of autumn. I was immersed in raw beauty, far from civilization, in a place where I could completely disconnect. The trail itself wasn't like the well-marked ones you find in national parks. There were no informational signs or warning signals. It was an old mountain trail, rarely used, requiring navigational skills. I knew I would need a map and compass, and also rely on natural landmarks. Large rock formations, old trees, and even the mountaintop, which stood like a wall before me. The path wound through a dense forest, where the sun barely touched the ground, creating dark shadows that made the walk more challenging. The sound of my footsteps on the ground covered by dry leaves and branches cracking under my weight was the only thing breaking the silence. As the day passed, the forest grew quieter, denser, and I began to lose myself in my thoughts. I wanted to find a peaceful place, a refuge where I could take a deep breath and escape from the pressures of everyday life. During the first few hours, the only companions were the birds singing above and the soft sound of the wind passing through the trees. I was in awe of the peace, the absolute silence. There was no one, no phone, nothing to distract me. Just me and nature in a silent and calm dance. But something inside me knew that, despite all the beauty around, solitude also brought something else. Something unknown. Something I couldn't control. As I ascended the trail, the landscape began to change. The trees became sparser and the terrain rockier. The mountaintop was now within reach. I knew that once I got there, I would see a hidden lake surrounded by snow-capped peaks, the final destination of my hike. Even so, a slight sense of discomfort started to grow inside me. The forest, though stunning, also felt threatening. It seemed denser, deeper, as if it were slowly swallowing me. The sound of the wind in the leaves and the cracking of trees made me feel like something was changing in the atmosphere. Still, I pressed on, determined to complete the journey. The evening approached, and as the light began to fade, I started looking for a place to set up camp. I knew it would be better to do this before night fully set in. But as I prepared my camp, a strange feeling that I wasn't alone began to take hold of me. I was in an open field, surrounded only by trees and the trail behind me, but something didn't feel right. The wind started to blow stronger, as if the environment itself was stirring around me. Looking at the shadows cast by the trees, I began to feel that I was no longer just alone with nature. The feeling of being watched slowly grew like a weight on my chest. I tried to push the thought away, convincing myself that it was just the fear of loneliness speaking louder. But as the sky darkened, that feeling only intensified. It was already night when I finished setting up the tent and starting the fire. The flames danced, casting distorted shadows on the ground. I was exhausted but also calm, imagining how the next day would unfold. The lake was within reach, and I knew it would be worth the effort to get there. However, as I sat there, watching the fire and hearing the crackling wood, an even more unsettling feeling overtook me. It was as if someone was watching every move I made, but there was no one around. I was alone. At least that's what I wanted to believe. That's when I heard the sound. Crack. Something breaking. A branch, perhaps. But in that moment, I didn't dare turn and look immediately. Instead, I kept my gaze fixed on the fire, trying to process what I had just heard. The sound of a branch breaking wasn't something you often heard in the forest, especially when you were in such a remote place. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just an animal. But something deep inside me told me that it wasn't natural. It wasn't just an animal. Suddenly the sound returned. An even louder crack, as if something large had stepped on a dry branch. I froze, my heart racing. I felt as if the air around me had grown heavier, and for a moment, the only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat, so loud in my ears that it seemed impossible for any other sound to be happening around me. Without hesitation, I went to the tent, grabbed the flashlight, and turned it on. The light's glow cut through the darkness, illuminating only a small circle around me. I decided to step out and look, trying to calm my mind, but when I left the tent and shone the light on the ground behind me, I saw nothing. Just the empty field and the dark forest stretching in front of me. There were no signs of animals or any other presence. I took a deep breath and tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then, as I was heading back to the tent and turned off the flashlight, I heard the crack once again. This time it was closer. I froze in place, not knowing what to do. Someone was approaching me, but I couldn't see anything beyond the shadows of the forest. I was no longer alone. My whole body was on high alert, and a wave of terror began to take over me. I ran back into the tent, locked the entrance and stayed there with the sound of wood cracking all around me. The feeling of being watched didn't disappear, and I knew something was out there, waiting, observing, waiting for the right moment. The night passed in darkness. I barely managed to sleep, my senses heightened with every sound, every crack, every movement in the darkness. Fear seemed to consume everything. When the day finally arrived, I was exhausted, but I knew I had to move on. I couldn't stay there another minute. I continued my journey to the lake, but something had changed. The fear lingered, and the feeling that I was no longer alone continued to haunt me. The lake, despite being beautiful and serene, did not bring peace. On the contrary, everything seemed intensified, as if the forest itself was alive and watching me from afar. I ended up setting up camp by the lake, feeling as though the invisible eyes were still there, watching me. With every step, every noise, I could feel the presence of something strange, but I couldn't see anything. When night fell, the sensation of being followed came back with full force. I was being hunted, though I couldn't see my hunter. Soon during the night, something happened. I woke up to the sound of someone running, quick and heavy footsteps approaching my tent. My heart raced and I ran outside, but there was nothing there. Just the thick morning fog. But then, when I looked at the ground, I saw something that made me freeze. Footprints, large and deep, all around my tent. That's when I understood. I wasn't just being watched. I was being hunted. From that moment on, the forest became my prison. I knew something was out there, always following me, waiting for the right moment. And I might never know who or what was behind those silent steps. I just knew I was no longer safe, and that field, that lake, that forest were no longer places of peace, but of something much darker. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. The footprints around my tent were deep, as if someone, or something, had circled me during the night. Fear spread through my body like an electric shock. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, had become inescapable. I was alone in the forest, and the forest now seemed to be against me. When the sun began to rise, a light mist hung over the lake, creating a ghostly atmosphere. I knew I needed to head back, but the thought of continuing my journey paralyzed me. Fear consumed me, but the need to get out of there outweighed it. I quickly packed up my gear, trying not to make a sound, and began walking away from the lake, trying to remember the route I would take to get back to the main road. The way back seemed longer and more barren than before. The forest, which had been my ally, now became a prison, a dense jungle full of traps. With every step, I felt like I was being watched, felt the weight of the invisible presence as if I was being hunted. But when I started climbing a rocky hill, the situation took an even more disturbing turn. As I looked back, something froze me in place. Amidst the fog, a figure appeared, standing, watching me from a distance. The silhouette of a person, or something that looked like a person, standing between the trees, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. What shocked me wasn't just the presence of someone there, but the fact that I knew for sure that there was no one else on the trail. The idea that someone could be watching me from so far away, from a spot I had never noticed, made me freeze to the bone. I was paralyzed, trying to process what I was seeing. The figure didn't move, but its presence was undeniable. My breath became heavy, my body shook, but I couldn't look away. That's when, suddenly, the figure moved. Abruptly, as if it were a shadow leaping from the darkness, it disappeared between the trees. I didn't see the movement clearly, but I felt the sensation that something was getting closer. Panic took over me. I ran like never before. I didn't look back. My only concern was to find my way back to the road and to civilization. I needed to get out of there, and fast. My legs were tired, but the adrenaline kept me moving, making me run non-stop without thinking. But with every curve in the trail, I felt that the figure was getting closer. The sound of my own footsteps blended with the rustling of leaves behind me. Something was there, always behind me, always watching, and my heart beat faster with every breath. When I finally saw the end of the trail and the road in the distance, a brief moment of relief washed over me, but the feeling of being pursued didn't lessen. The road seemed farther away, farther than I remembered. I was exhausted, my muscles burning, but I couldn't stop. I knew I couldn't stop. Finally, when I reached the road, I looked back one last time, trying to find any sign of who, or what, had been following me, but there was nothing. What made me sure that something was there, watching, was the absolute silence. The absence of sound, as if the forest had closed itself around me, was deafening. I almost reached my car when a sense of emptiness overtook me. Something was wrong. The world around me felt strange. The road was too quiet. There were no signs of life, no other vehicles. Just an oppressive stillness, a feeling that time itself had stopped. When I opened the car door and sat in the seat, the first thing I noticed was that my backpack felt lighter than before. Something was missing. In my haste to escape, I hadn't realized it, but now, with my nerves on edge, I realized that some of the essential things had disappeared. Tools, some food packets, and most alarmingly, my map. I forced myself not to think about what this meant, but the feeling of having been subtly robbed, while being watched, while in motion, made me feel even more vulnerable. I started the car, trying to control my breathing. When I finally got the vehicle moving, the wheels screeching on the dirt road, I felt that, for a brief moment, I had escaped that nightmare. But even while driving, something didn't feel right. The emptiness I felt was deeper, as if a part of me had stayed behind, as if I was still being watched. The worst came when, looking in the rearview mirror, one last image froze me. In the darkness, on the edge of the road, something was moving. A shadow. It wasn't a person, but something more fluid, darker, that seemed to be crawling along the trail I had just walked. I blinked, trying to convince myself it was an illusion. But when I looked again, the shadow disappeared, as if it had swallowed the night itself. I sped up, not looking back, with the feeling that that place would never let me go. That, somehow, I would never truly leave that forest. Whatever had followed me, or whatever had made me feel that constant presence, was now a part of me. I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that I hadn't escaped, because the forest, with its silent trees and distorted shadows, had marked me in a way I could never erase. And as I drove away, I felt deep in my being that the real journey, the journey to escape, was only just beginning.